With the advent of the new year, I've been thinking about the best way to conduct my affairs going forward, and this is what I came up with. Go right into the teeth of the storm. Set your course according to the peak level of resistance to what you are saying, doing, and thinking. Wherever they don't want you to go, that's your correct path. The more they are disturbed by your actions, the more sure you can be that you are getting it right. The conclusion of a life well lived is when they finally can tolerate you no longer and decide that your life must be ended. George Carlin has said that the last thing they want is a citizenry capable of critical thinking. I also think they don't want a citizenry that realizes it's come to the end of its rope and needs to do something about it. Keaton Weiss of Due Dissidence was talking about despondency and despair being a key reason for people not masking up and resisting the COVID virus. I'd say another outcome of despair, economic, health, or whatever kind of despair, is that you don't care really whether you live or die, at least if the quality of life is going to continue as it has been. And then you conclude that if the powers are the reason your life is not as good, then you'll do whatever it takes to your last breath to resist them and to overthrow them. I'm going to share 2 articles by Birrion Sondahl today, both from Real Progressive's website. The first is called No War But Class War. The second is a Marxist solution to the eviction crisis. Before I start those, I want to urge you to copy and paste all of these Twitter addresses, from Jimmy Dore to Representative Barbara Lee, and share with them something about your feelings regarding Force the Vote, #ForceTheVote. Let them know if you don't have health insurance. Let them know how important it is for our whole society to have health insurance. Share with them, if you like, admonitions to be brave. Let them know that life is short, and if they can make a difference, they should do it now while they have the chance. If you haven't been following the Force the Vote story, they need to put pressure on Nancy Pelosi. They need to withhold their vote from her as Speaker unless she's willing to bring Medicare for All to the floor of the House for a vote. If you're bumping into this idea for the first time right now, you should go to Jimmy Dore's YouTube channel and watch his episodes on this idea. You can also find out if you go to Force the Vote hashtag on Twitter. That hashtag also is used on Facebook. You also can go to the website forcethevote.org. No War But Class War by Birrion Sondahl. As Joe Biden fills his cabinet with war hawks, it is inevitable that the next 4 years will see the continuation of aggressive U.S. imperialism and war. The military-industrial complex has the full support of the president-elect and the Democratic Party establishment. It will be up to us to lead the effort to counter this aggression and bring back a strong anti-war movement to the United States. History shows that while opposition to war is a difficult path, it is the only moral stance we can take. The non-binding Democratic platform claims Democrats will deliver on this overdue commitment to end the forever wars, and we will do it responsibly, setting priorities, leading with diplomacy, protecting ourselves from terrorist threats, enabling local partners, and bringing our troops home. Yet, in stark contrast to the platform, this summer Democratic Representative Jason Crow of Colorado worked with Republican Representative Liz Cheney, boo, to craft legislation preventing the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. More Republicans than Democrats voted against this amendment. The same is true of the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act that budgets $740.5 billion for the military. Actions speak louder than words, and the actions of the Democratic Party are not those of an anti-war party. So if you're an anti-war citizen, I don't know why in hell you'd want to be connected with the Democratic Party in any way at all. The Democratic Party has embraced endless wars. President-elect Joe Biden has been busy filling his cabinet with pro-war members. For Secretary of Defense, Joe Biden has selected Lloyd Austin. Lloyd Austin is currently on the board of directors of Raytheon Technologies. I found out he also owns stock in Raytheon Technologies. Raytheon is a major supplier of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and these weapons have been used in the war against Yemen, killing children. But Biden justifies the choice of Lloyd Austin because he will be the first African American to helm the Defense Department. Another milestone in a barrier-breaking career dedicated to keeping the American people secure. This is blatant weaponization of identity politics to support the military-industrial complex and corporate handouts for defense manufacturers. Ding, ding, ding! Putting a board member of Raytheon in charge of the Defense Department is not a step forward. The most blatantly insulting choice to progressives is Joe Biden's nomination of Neera Tanden for Office of Management and Budget Director. Neera Tanden once said of Libya, "We have a giant deficit. They have a lot of oil." This is clear support of imperialism war for oil. Regarding the conflict in Syria, she tweeted, "On Syria, while I don't want to be the world's policeman, an unpoliced world is dangerous. The US may be the only adult in the room left." Considering the police are waging war on minorities in the US, the description of the US as the world's policeman is apt. The choice of Neera Tanden is another indication that the storm clouds of war are brewing over a Biden administration. The list goes on. Antony Blinken, Biden's choice for Secretary of State, supported the war in Iraq and intervention in Libya. His latest job was as an executive of West Exec Advisors, a strategic consultancy firm working closely with aerospace and defense companies. Avril Haines, Biden's pick for Director of National Intelligence, also worked at West Exec Advisors. She was on the team that helped cover up CIA torture and was a staunch supporter of Obama's drone strike program. Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, said in a recent interview that we should deepen our support for Saudi and we're going to be holding Iran's feet to the fire. He also authored an article in The Atlantic in defense of American exceptionalism. These are just a few of the swamp monsters Biden and his team have selected to continue a legacy of endless war and state-sponsored terrorism. Biden can claim his cabinet is diverse in gender and race, but it is homogeneous when it comes to supporting the military-industrial complex and neoliberal policies of austerity. At the top, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris both have records of supporting war. Joe Biden argued for war in Iraq in 1998. He co-authorized a bill with John McCain that opened up the possibility of a ground invasion in Kosovo. Kamala Harris voted against Bernie Sanders' amendment to reduce military spending by 10% and in favor of the $740.5 billion National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA. Only time will tell how long after inauguration it will be before these two cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. When the war comes under Biden's leadership, the media will propagandize and glorify it. When President Trump launched a Tomahawk missile strike on Syria in 2017, Fareed Zakaria declared on CNN, "I think Donald Trump became President of the United States." MSNBC anchor Brian Williams described the strike saying, "I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, 'I am guided by the beauty of our weapons.' And they are beautiful pictures of fierce armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield. In the eyes of the profit-driven corporate media, death and destruction is beautiful." This is typical of the media. Writing of the Gulf War, Norman Solomon tells us, in total, FAIR found only 1.5% of the sources were identified as American anti-war demonstrators. Out of 878 sources cited on the newscasts, just one was a leader of a U.S. peace organization. The mainstream media will silence anti-war voices and amplify those in favor of U.S. imperialism and aggression. Birrion is right about that. You can absolutely count on that. The socialist movement and the anti-war movement have gone hand in hand throughout history. On June 16, 1918, in Canton, Ohio, socialist leader Eugene V. Debs said, "The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has had all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and all to lose, especially their lives." As a result of this speech, Debs was arrested and imprisoned. During his trial, he reinforced his anti-war position, saying, "I have been accused of obstructing the war. I admit it. Gentlemen, I abhor war. I would oppose the war if I stood alone." This stance was not just that of Debs, but was the official platform of the Socialist Party of the United States. In an anti-war proclamation, they wrote, Our entrance into the European war was instigated by the predatory capitalists in the United States who boast of the enormous profit of $7 billion from the manufacture and sale of munitions and war supplies, from the exportation of American foodstuffs and other necessaries. Capitalist war profits today remain a driving force behind the endless wars. In his book, War is a Racket, Major General Smedley Butler explained that big business profited greatly off of World War I. As he wrote, "It has been estimated by statisticians and economists and researchers that the war cost your Uncle Sam $52 billion. Of this sum, $39 billion was expended in the actual war itself. This expenditure yielded $16 billion in profits. The capitalists profited off a war in which they did not fight. The working class were killed and maimed while the capitalists reaped the benefits. The owners of the defense manufacturers do not go to war. That is left to the poor who are drafted or lured into volunteering to serve with the offer of free college tuition and health care. As Smedley Butler noted, so capital won't permit the taking of the profit out of war until the people, those who do the suffering and still pay the price, make up their minds that those they elect to office shall do their bidding, and not that of the profiteers. The United States remains an oligarchy run by corporations for profit, and the war machine is a huge part of it. The people must unite together against war and the capitalist system driving it." When the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. gave his speech, Beyond Vietnam, he brought forth many of the same criticisms as Eugene V. Debs and Smedley Butler. It is with such activity that the words of the late John F. Kennedy come back to haunt us. 5 years ago, he said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Increasingly, by choice or by accident, this is the role our nation has taken. The role of those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investments. I am convinced that if we are to get onto the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This must be the basis of the new anti-war movement. It must be oriented on the well-being of all people as opposed to the profits of the capitalists. War is not a matter of small consequences. Indeed, the future of civilization is at stake. The United States war machine is the biggest polluter on the planet, contributing greatly to the climate crisis. The biggest threat to the continuation of human life on the planet are nuclear war and climate change. A Biden administration full of war hawks is not going to save us from these threats. As the Russell-Einstein Manifesto states, "Here then is the problem which we present to you, stark and dreadful and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? These are our choices, and in the words of MLK Jr., our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and unjust mores, and thereby speed the day when every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. The crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. It is up to us to take to the streets and have our voices heard. No war but class war." And now we turn to Birrion's other article, A Marxist Solution to the Eviction Crisis. Up top is this quotation by Friedrich Engels from The Housing Question, 1872. "As long as the capitalist mode of production continues to exist, it is folly to hope for an isolated solution of the housing question or of any other social question affecting the fate of the workers. The solution lies in the abolition of the capitalist mode of production and the appropriation of all the means of life and labor by the working class itself." Those are fighting words. The United States is facing an eviction crisis of unprecedented proportions. According to U.S. Census data, 35.3% of the United States is under threat of eviction or foreclosure. This means over a third of the population is not current on their rent or mortgage payments, and eviction or foreclosure in the next 2 months is likely. The CDC ordered a moratorium on evictions in September, which is set to expire on December 31st. That was 2 days ago. This temporary halt only covered evictions for non-payment, and therefore many evictions are still occurring. Carrying out evictions during the pandemic has been associated with increasing COVID-19 incidence and mortality, supporting the public health rationale for use of eviction moratoriums to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The lack of action on the part of the federal government regarding the eviction crisis is putting millions of lives at risk. The heartlessness of the actions of those carrying out evictions in the middle of winter in a pandemic cannot be understated. A company named Civil is now hiring people as eviction crew and advertising themselves as the fastest growing money-making gig due to COVID-19. Their pitch for landlords starts out, "Evicting tenants from your rental property is not something we like doing, but if compelled by circumstances, we have no choice but to carry out the eviction." This is the utmost cruelty, hiring working-class people to evict tenants from their homes and make a profit from it. If you get a chance, dear viewers and listeners, go back to the episode of Crystal Ball on the Hill Rising, and she shows somebody actually evicting an old woman. The man doing the evicting is a middle-aged Hispanic man, and he's bawling as he's trying to kick this older woman out of her house. Fastest growing money-making gig. God help anyone who has to do that for a living. Back to Birrion. This eviction crisis is a part of a larger crisis, a crisis of capitalism. The capitalist system is designed around inequality. As Marx explained in Capital, Volume 1, but all methods for the production of surplus value are at the same time methods of accumulation, and every extension of accumulation becomes again a means for the development of those methods. It follows, therefore, that in proportion as capital accumulates, the lot of the laborer, be his payment high or low, must grow worse. The law, finally, that always equilibrates the relative surplus population or industrial reserve army to the extent and energy of accumulation, this law rivets the laborer to capital more firmly than the wedges of Vulcan did Prometheus to the rock. That was very literary and poetic. It establishes an accumulation of misery corresponding with accumulation of capital. That's so well stated. It establishes an accumulation of misery corresponding with accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation, at the opposite pole, i.e. on the side of the class that produces its own product in the form of capital. To put it simply, the more the capitalists, bourgeoisie, make, the worse are the material conditions of the working class, proletariat, because capitalist profits are taken out of the labor of the working class. The unemployed and the homeless are a byproduct of this function of the capitalist system. The COVID-19 pandemic simply highlights the disparities between the classes. During the 1870s, Germany faced a housing shortage due to an influx of workers into urban industrial centers. Friedrich Engels addressed this shortage in a series of articles entitled The Housing Question. Although the circumstances around the modern-day U.S. eviction crisis are different, the way in which Engels answered this question remains relevant. Engels addresses the fact that poor living conditions are conducive to epidemics, as he writes, "Modern natural science has proved that the so-called poor districts in which the workers are crowded together are the breeding places of all those epidemics which from time to time afflict our towns. The pandemic has highlighted this as it has had a greater impact on the working class than the ruling class. The only billionaire being evicted is Donald Trump from the White House, while millions of working class citizens are facing eviction. The distribution of the vaccine going to oligarchs like Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell before much of the population highlights the imbalance between classes. According to Dr. Krishna Udayakumar, something like 90% of all the vaccine doses that have been purchased have actually been done directly by countries, mostly middle-income and high-income countries, as opposed to low-income countries. Capitalism is a global system, and these inequities are seen on a global scale. The richest people and countries receive the vaccine first, while the poorest are left to die. There have been some attempts to address this crisis. For instance, Representative Ilhan Omar introduced the Homes for All Act in 2019. This bill would create new public housing in sufficient numbers to end homelessness. However, it only has 6 co-sponsors and will never see the light of day in a corporate-controlled Congress. Even if it were to pass, it only addresses the symptom of homelessness and not the problem of a social order which allows for homelessness. The same is true of the latest COVID-19 relief bill, which would extend the moratorium on evictions and offer limited rental assistance. These bills do not go far enough. As Engels explains, it is the essence of bourgeois socialism to want to maintain the basis of all the evils of present-day society and at the same time to want to abolish the evils themselves. It is not enough to simply build more housing, offer rental assistance, or to further suspend evictions. The fundamental failures of capitalism must be addressed. As Engels outlines, the reason for the housing shortage is that it is a necessary product of the bourgeois social order, that it cannot fail to be present in a society in which the great masses of the workers are exclusively dependent upon wages, that is to say, on the sum of foodstuffs necessary for their existence and for the propagation of their kind, in which improvements of the existing machinery continually throw masses of workers out of employment, in which violent and regularly recurring industrial vacillations determine, on the one hand, the existence of a large reserve army of unemployed workers, and on the other hand, drive large masses of the workers temporarily unemployed onto the streets, in which the workers are crowded together in masses in the big towns at a quicker rate than dwellings come into existence for them under existing conditions, in which, therefore, there must always be tenants even for the most infamous pigsties, and in which, finally, the house owner in his capacity as capitalist has not only the right, but, in view of the competition, to a certain extent also the duty of ruthlessly making as much out of his property in house rent as he possibly can. In such a society, the housing shortage is no accident. It is a necessary institution, and it can be abolished together with all its effects on health, etc., only if the whole social order from which it springs is fundamentally refashioned. The eviction crisis is not an accident. It is a product of the capitalist system. To expect the government to produce an actual solution would be pure folly. In the words of Engels, it is perfectly clear that the existing state is neither able nor willing to do anything to remedy the housing difficulty. The state is nothing but the organized collective power of the possessing classes, the landowners and the capitalists, as against the exploited classes, the peasants and the workers. It will be up to the people to fight for housing justice. There have already been some examples of this fight throughout the United States. In the Bronx, 14 tenants carried out a rent strike in a 30-unit building. This was just one small action of many rent strikes and calls to cancel rent. In Portland, Oregon, protesters occupied the streets around the Red House at 4406 North Mississippi Street to block the eviction of the Kinney family who lost the house to foreclosure. The future of the Kinney family and the Red House remains to be determined, but the heroic stand of the people in their defense should be an inspiration as more people face eviction. Rent strikes and eviction defenses must become the norm across the country as the capitalist class carries out their agenda of mass evictions. The government could easily provide housing for all if it so desires through both a jobs and a homes guarantee. Modern monetary theory tells us this, but the oligarchs refuse to provide these essential programs. This is because the government represents the interests of the capitalists, as was the case in Germany 150 years ago when Engels wrote, "Capital does not desire to abolish the housing shortage even if it could. This has now been completely established." There is no shortage of available housing in the United States. As Engels notes, but one thing is certain, there are already in existence sufficient buildings for dwellings in the big towns to remedy immediately any real housing shortage given rational utilization of them. This can naturally only take place by the expropriation of the present owners and by quartering in their houses the homeless or those workers excessively overcrowded in their former houses. That would be something to see. In 2019, there were 59 vacant properties for each homeless person in the U.S. 59 vacant properties for each homeless person in the U.S. The increased number of evictions brought on by the coronavirus pandemic is only increasing this disparity. It is a cruel and heartless system that allows people to remain homeless when housing is available. It is an even worse system that kicks people out into the cold in the middle of a global pandemic. Yet this is what the ruling class of the United States is doing. The expropriation of empty housing might seem radical to some, but it is far more compassionate than allowing people to die of exposure due to homelessness. Anarcho-communist Peter Kropotkin said it best in his blueprint for revolution, the conquest of bread. On the day that the expropriation of houses takes place, on that day the exploited workers will have realized that the new times have come, that labor will no longer have to bear the yoke of the rich and powerful, that equality has been openly proclaimed, that this revolution is a real fact and not a theatrical make-believe like so many others preceding it. The only solution to the eviction crisis remains the same solution Engels gave us. In order to make an end of this housing shortage, there is only one means: to abolish altogether the exploitation and oppression of the working class by the ruling class. There are no true solutions within the capitalist system. The only solution must come through a change in the system that brings the means of production under control of the working class. Engels gives us hope for a better future when he says, "The possibility of securing for every member of society by means of socialized production an existence not only fully sufficient materially and becoming day by day more full, but an existence guaranteeing to all the free development and exercise of their physical and mental faculties. This possibility is now for the first time here, but it is here. It is up to us to make this future a reality."